back to Professor Jordan's Whys of History, where last time we were talking about Franz Ferdinand and the conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary that suddenly exploded into a massive worldwide bar fight faster than the time it takes Sam to get frostbite by doing snow angels. If you need a refresher or just want to see more of my lovable face, you can click on Franz's head over here to go back to part 1. Otherwise, without further ado, we're going to look at part 2/3 of why the assassination of Franz Ferdinand started a world war. Part 2, the in-depth answer, or just how inevitable was it that this assassination would start a world war? Firstly, the century before this war could rightfully be called the Age of Imperialism, as Europe, in particular France and Britain, found themselves 2 new continents to conquer: Africa and Asia. While Europeans had been involved in both of these places for quite a while, most notably through the slave trade in Africa and the trade of tea, silk, and spices in India and China, the 1800s saw an unprecedented scramble for territory and people across the globe. And with any good scramble for anything, one generally has winners and losers. Not to mention the people whose, land and resources were being, scrambled for. This dramatically increased tension across Europe, as there was only so much territory and resources to go around, and exploiting the land of other people tends to make you rich and powerful. Countries who didn't get the lion's share of Africa were desperate for any territories they could find, which became more and more difficult as countries like Russia, Japan, and the United States began looking to make their own empires in the late 1800s. The competition and power associated with empires and empire building began to fray the fairly long-standing agreements European powers had made to keep the overall peace, and it looked more and more likely that diplomacy would eventually fail and lead to conflict. Things would get really hairy when the 600-year-old Ottoman Empire, once so powerful it had scared the Spanish monarchy into sending some Italian explorer across the Atlantic to find a western route to Asia, began to really fall apart in the late 1800s. Countries like Algeria, Egypt, Greece, and many states in the Balkans that had long been under Turkish rule found themselves independent as Ottoman control weakened, only then to find themselves gobbled back up by a European imperial power, which really didn't go over well, particularly in, say, Bosnia and Serbia. The next big idea that I want to discuss is nationalism, or the idea that you belong to a unique nation and should therefore love and support that nation, often over yourself. Nationalism is responsible for roughly 35 bisquillion events in history, and this assassination is definitely one of them. Nationalism often takes a competitive form, one that is still very present in Europe today, but wasn't always as docile? As empires grew in the 1800s, they not only became a source of wealth and political power, but one of competing elements of national pride. Europeans, like the French, sought to conquer Africa and Asia to prove how awesome the French were, then use the colonies they obtained to show how awesome the French were, while at the same time the people they conquered, like the Vietnamese or the Algerians, were using nationalism to point out that they were not in fact French and shouldn't be controlled by Frenchmen. This conflicting nationalism not only encouraged the empires that caused the tension that would help our powder keg explode, but the desire of Serbs and Bosnians to be ruled by, well, Serbs and Bosnians and not Turks or Austrians is a key element of nationalism, and one that would obviously play a pretty large role. Finally, paranoia was rampant in European political circles, especially surrounding Germany. Germany had, for hundreds of years, been neither unified nor treated very well by the other European powers, and their unification under one Otto von Bismarck left Europe very uneasy. France was especially unhappy as they lost a fair amount of territory when failing to prevent German unification. Russia was unhappy because they had this massive border with Germany they couldn't defend. The UK was unhappy because Germany was all up building navies and taking colonies, and that was Britain's job. And Germany was unhappy because they saw themselves beset with enemies who had, historically speaking, a bit of a trend of doing whatever they could to keep Germany fractured. Fearing that war was inevitable, all the major powers of Europe built up their armies and navies and began to make alliances with one another, hoping that the massive armies and large networks of friends could deter anyone from declaring war on anyone else, which was a great idea until it totally fell apart and became a terrible idea. So, to recap, political tension over empires in the 1800s left the major European powers armed to the teeth and paranoid that any one of them could attack any other at any time. It is for this reason that many in Europe saw a massive war as inevitable, though the event that sparked it, that ever so lucky assassination driven by nationalism, hardly seems certain. Part 3, the life lessons and relevance thing. So what can we learn from this event? Well, World War I is widely noted in historical circles as accomplishing basically nothing beneficial, not to mention the death of between 17 and 20 million people, or the fact that it allowed for the global spread of Spanish flu, the worst epidemic in human history. On top of all of this, World War I would directly contribute to the global powder keg that would explode into World War II. It's also worth noting that diplomacy, the idea that we can solve our problems without fighting, completely fell apart in the years leading up to the war. In fact, the incompetence, short-sightedness, and warmongering of both Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia would lead them both to be deposed by their own people by the time the war was out. While it's easy to look back and wonder why nobody in Europe did much to prevent a war that the majority of these nations had no real stake in, I mean, seriously, I'd argue your average European soldier probably couldn't point to Sarajevo on a map. One has to put themselves in the context and again think about how inevitability might play into this. Times are tense, almost everyone is armed to the teeth, and the rise of Germany and the decline of the Ottoman Empire is stressing the fragile balance of power in Europe. Austria-Hungary had one of its leaders assassinated by a rival country, yet knew that if they retaliated against Serbia, Russia and Germany would almost certainly enter the war. Germany knew that if it gave the go-ahead to Austria-Hungary and ultimately declared war on Russia, it was only a matter of time before France attacked. And they knew if they invaded Belgium, they would more than likely drag the UK into the war. This chain of events was arguably certain, definitely predictable, and probably inevitable. While some in Europe felt that the power of trade and the money being made would prevent the colossal market destabilizer and money sink that is a world war, plenty of others saw that this was a domino trail 100 years in the making that was only gonna fall one way. While it may not have been that assassination that almost didn't happen that set off this line of dominoes, it certainly does seem that this was something darn close to inevitable. Finally, on that note, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is one of history's many striking examples of the inability of people, nations, and leaders to address both short-term and long-term problems that can lead to disastrous consequences. While it's easy to point to the assassination or Russia's escalation of the war or Germany's invasion of Belgium/France as the cause of the war, I hope I've made it clear that long-term issues like imperialism, nationalism, and paranoia were even more so to blame. Not to mention the fact that the alliance system backfiring and dragging everyone into a war was a possibility almost anyone could have seen coming, and perhaps more importantly, few people in power took steps to actually avoid. Looking at this event reminds us that decisions that were made even generations ago can have very massive and very direct ramifications for the future, and that we should be actively working to address those decisions and be mindful of the way that our decisions might affect those who come after us. After all, no matter how big or small the world gets, history continuously reminds us that the actions of men we've never met, in places we've never heard of, doing things we've never done, can, if we're not careful, still have a great impact on the things we hold very dear. Thank you very much for watching. If you have questions, concerns, philosophical discussions, as well as other whys of history you'd like answered/ranted about, or topics you'd like discussed, please throw them in a comment. I appreciate your time. I'm Professor Jordan, and I will see you all next class.
Rambling, and oh how I was rambling, and the Taco Bell dog came and visited, and his name is Gizmo, but he died, and I guess like 5 or 6 years ago, because he's a dog and they don't live that long, and really it's tragic, but you know, that's just how things work. Anyway, I was rambling, and so I'm walking down the street rambling at this guy, and he's just like, who are you? I'm like, man, I don't even know anymore. It turns out I was suffering from temporary amnesia, and I had forgotten literally everything, so they had to reconstruct my memories through a series of events, and they set me down a computer, and the next thing I know, I was reliving my life backwards. It was pretty far out, and turns out my name is Mark Hamill.
Question. I'm 90% sure that Taco Bell dog is not named Gizmo.
No, he totally is.
What?